The fluorescent lights in the fourth-floor hallway of Carver Regional Medical Center had always been too bright. Senna Vail had never minded them. Not in 3 years of overnight shifts, not through 12-hour stretches that ran into 16 without anyone asking if she needed water, but standing there at 9:30 on a Thursday morning, with Roger Stahl's voice bouncing off every flat surface like something designed specifically to hurt, she noticed them for the first time. They left nowhere to hide. "Are you even listening to me?" Stahl took another step forward. He was 53, broad-shouldered in a way that had probably meant something in his 30s, wearing a blazer that cost more than Senna's monthly rent. His father occupied room 412, corner suite, window view, private attending physician, which, in Stahl's mind, seemed to translate into ownership of the entire ward. I said, "Where is the attending?" "Mr. Stahl." Senna kept her voice measured, the way she'd been trained to, the way she'd taught herself long before any training started. "Dr. Benning finished rounds an hour ago. If you'd like, I can." "I don't want to hear what you can do." He cut her off without blinking. "I want results. My father has been in this bed for 6 days, and not one person on this floor has given me a straight answer about anything." That wasn't true, and they both knew it. Senna had sat with Walter Stahl 3 times in the past week, once to go over his discharge criteria, twice because the old man couldn't sleep and wanted someone to talk to. She'd explained his prognosis to Roger Stahl on 2 separate occasions, calmly, with documentation. She had answered every question he sent through the nursing station. She had done everything correctly, by the book, by the standard that kept patients safe and families informed without crossing lines that existed for good reasons. None of it mattered to him. What mattered was the hallway, the audience. The nurses clustered near the station at the far end. Tamara Rue had frozen with a chart pressed to her chest. A student nurse whose name Senna still didn't know had pressed herself against the wall, and the family members seated in the waiting alcove who were doing that thing people do when they want to watch, without appearing to watch. Roger Stahl, Senna had understood for days now, was the kind of man who needed witnesses. "You people have no idea what my father's time is worth," he said louder. The word people landed like something thrown. "You walk around this place like you're doing everyone a favor. You're nurses. This is your job." Senna set her tablet down on the medication cart beside her. Slowly, deliberately, the way she did everything in a confrontation, because the one thing she had learned working trauma in ICU for 6 years was that the moment you moved fast, you looked afraid. She was not afraid. She was something worse, actually. She was tired. Bone-tired in the specific way that accumulates in people who give more than they should for longer than anyone notices. Senna had entered nursing at 23 with no illusions about the pay scale or the gratitude ratio. She'd grown up in a small house in northern Kentucky with a mother who worked 2 jobs and still found time to bring food to elderly neighbors, and she had understood from early on that some work was simply what you owed the world. She had not expected applause. She had not expected this either. "Mr. Stahl." She said it quietly enough that he had to stop talking to hear her. "I understand that you're frightened. Watching a parent." "Don't." His voice dropped to something colder, more precise. "Don't psychologize me. Don't do the thing where you make this about my feelings so you don't have to answer for your incompetence." Incompetence. The word landed in the hallway and stayed there. Tamara took a small step from the nurse's station, then stopped. The student nurse looked at the floor. The family in the waiting alcove had given up pretending not to watch. Senna had made a mistake 2 days earlier, a genuine one, not the kind Stahl was inventing. She had called to confirm his father's afternoon blood draw and left a message that misstated the time by 30 minutes. She had corrected it within the hour. She had logged it. Dr. Benning had reviewed it and called it a non-event. It had been exactly that. To Roger Stahl, it had been fuel. "That phone call," he said, "was the 3rd time this week your department has failed to provide basic competent communication. If my father's condition changes because of your negligence—" "His condition isn't going to change," Senna said. "His vitals this morning—" "Stop talking." He stepped so close she could smell the coffee on his breath. "Just stop. I have dealt with people like you my entire career. People who think that showing up is enough. that wearing that uniform means something. His gaze dropped briefly to her scrubs, teal, the same ones she'd worn for 15 hours now, and came back up with something in it that wasn't quite contempt. It was the specific cruelty of dismissal. The kind that says, "You are not worth the effort of real anger. You're just in my way. My attorney will be calling the hospital administrator by noon. I want to know this complaint is being taken seriously, and I want to know it now." Senna opened her mouth. "I'm not finished." He raised his voice again, loud enough that a door opened down the hall, a patient peering out, and the waiting family went very still. "Do you know what my father built? Do you have any idea the donations this family has made to this institution? Your whole department runs on money that came from people like us, and you can't manage a phone call." She had been in the hallway for 11 minutes. Later, she would remember it as longer. The kind of time that bends under pressure, stretches at the edges so that every second carries weight. The nurses at the station weren't moving. She understood why. Roger Stahl's family had, in fact, donated substantially to the cardiac wing 3 years ago. There was a plaque in the lobby. The hospital administrator had attended the dinner. Nobody in that hallway was unaware of the calculus being performed. The silent institutional arithmetic that sometimes meant a nurse stood alone and absorbed what a wealthy man's son chose to throw at her. Senna had always believed, stubbornly, in the dignity of the work. Not the recognition, she'd let go of that in her first year, but the work itself. The way a patient's breathing changed when you got the dosage right. The specific exhausted gratitude on a family member's face at 3 in the morning when you came in to explain, again and gently, what the monitors meant. She had carried that through every budget cut and mandatory overtime and administrator's memo about patient satisfaction scores, and she carried it now, standing in the too bright hallway while Roger Stahl used her as a target for everything he was afraid to feel. "I'd like you to step back," she said. He didn't. He leaned forward instead and said something she would never repeat to anyone, not even to Lawson. Something about her competence and her credentials, and the suggestion that someone with her education level ought to reconsider whether she belonged in a facility of this caliber. Her knees, she realized distantly, had locked. The floor was very white. Someone had dropped a pen near the medication cart, and it was lying there at an odd angle, and she was looking at it because she needed to look at something that wasn't his face. From the nurse's station, Tamara finally moved. 3 full steps forward before she stopped. Her mouth opened, her mouth closed. She looked at the floor. Nobody spoke. The hallway was perfectly, terribly quiet. And then, from the direction of the elevator bay, came a sound that Senna recognized before she understood why she recognized it. A sound she heard in her apartment sometimes, late at night, in the space between waking and sleeping. The sound of nails on a hard floor, sharp and rhythmic and purposeful. Like something with 4 legs that knew exactly where it was going. Like vigil. She had met Lawson Burke in an emergency room, which was, she sometimes thought, the only place where meeting happened with any real honesty. You didn't get to perform in an emergency room. You were either what you were or you weren't. He had been brought in by military transport 27 months earlier, a gunshot wound to the lower abdomen, stabilized in the field but bleeding where it mattered. Senna had been in her 2nd year of trauma nursing and her 4th consecutive shift. She had not been thinking about anything except the arterial pressure on her monitor and the 18 things she needed to do in the next 4 minutes. She had not looked at his face until the work was done. When she finally looked up, he was watching her with an expression she would take years to fully understand. Not gratitude, exactly. Something quieter, like recognition. Like he was cataloging something important. "You didn't talk," he said later, when he was coherent enough for conversation. "The whole time. Most people talk." "Talking takes oxygen," she said. He had laughed, and something in the sound of it told Senna she was in significant trouble. They married 13 months later in a small ceremony in her mother's backyard in Kentucky. 12 people, and her mother's good tablecloth, and a cake that Tamara Rue had driven 3 hours to deliver. Senna wore a white sundress. Lawson wore civilian clothes. Vigil sat at his feet the entire time, enormous and attentive and deeply unbothered by the proceedings. Vigil was a Belgian Malinois, 6 years old, with a scar behind his left ear from a mission Lawson had described in the vague, careful language of someone being technically accurate without being informative. Vigil had been with Lawson's unit for 3 years. He was, by any measure Senna had ever encountered, the most precise animal she had ever met. Not cold, never cold, but calibrated in some way that made her think of surgeons and architects and people who did complex work in high-stakes silence. She loved him in the particular way she loved things that were reliable. Lawson had shipped out for his current deployment 5 months ago, 7 months total. Senna had kept working. She wore her rings on a chain beneath her scrubs because patients sometimes fixated on jewelry, and because the private part of her life had always been private, and because she had not yet figured out the language for telling people about Lawson in a way that didn't feel like displaying something fragile. None of her colleagues knew, not Tamara, not Dr. Benning, nobody. She was, to the 4th floor of Carver Regional, simply Senna Vail, reliable, quiet, technically excellent, impossible to rattle. She was rattled now. The nails on the floor. Senna turned. Lawson Burke walked like someone who had learned long ago that moving through a space and claiming a space were different actions, and that the second one was usually optional. He did not walk fast. He never did, in Senna's experience, unless someone was in danger. But there was something in his pace that cleared a path anyway, the way air pressure changes before weather. He was still in his service uniform. Desert camouflage creased from 30 hours of travel, his chest bearing the quiet accumulation of things he'd earned and never talked about. He held Vigil's leash in his left hand, and Vigil moved beside him with the fluid precision of something purpose-built. Nails clicking on the linoleum in that exact pattern Senna knew from her own hallway at 6 in the morning. She would think later that she had not made a sound. But Lawson looked at her first, directly, immediately, as if the room held no other contents, and something crossed his face that she had seen before only in private, only in the 2 in the morning aftermath of his nightmares, only in moments when he thought she wasn't looking. Then he looked at Roger Stahl. Vigil had already looked at Roger Stahl. Stahl's posture changed before his expression did. The body understands threat assessment faster than the thinking mind, and something about 65 pounds of Malinois, moving with absolute directional certainty, triggered something old and involuntary in Roger Stahl's nervous system. He straightened. He stepped back. His chin went up in the specific way of a man who is recalculating. "Can I help you?" His voice had a new quality. Not fear, not exactly, the precursor to it. Lawson stopped 6 feet away. Vigil sat, not on any command Senna could detect, but with the ease of a dog who understood exactly what each specific situation required and had no need to be told. His eyes did not leave Roger Stahl. His ears were forward. He was not growling. He didn't need to. Lieutenant Commander Lawson Burke, United States Navy. He said it the way he said everything, evenly, without performance. "Is there something you'd like to say to my wife?" The hallway went from quiet to something deeper than quiet. Stahl blinked. "Your." "My wife." Lawson's eyes moved to Senna for just a moment, checking, she knew, the way he always checked, the way that had nothing to do with doubt and everything to do with care, and came back to Stahl. "Senna Vail, the nurse you've been speaking to." Stahl's mouth opened. Stahl's mouth closed. At the nurse's station, someone set down a clipboard. "I've been patient," Lawson said, and the word patient, from him, was not a virtue being claimed. It was a measurement, an accounting of exactly how long he had been watching from the elevator bay before deciding the appropriate moment had arrived. "Your father is receiving good care. I know this because I know this woman, and I know what good care looks like, and I know the kind of person who provides it. I also know that what I walked into is not a clinical dispute." "Now listen," Stahl started. "I'm not finished." The same phrase Stahl had used, but different in every other way. Stahl had used it to cut off. Lawson used it to close a door, gently, completely, on the possibility of interruption. "You called her incompetent in front of her colleagues, her patients' families, and people she has worked beside for years. You made statements about her education and her presence in this building." A pause, brief and absolute. "I'd like you to reconsider those statements." It was not a request, and everyone present understood that. Vigil had not moved. had not made a sound. He sat at Lawson's left side like something sculpted, his dark eyes tracking Stahl with attention that was entirely professional and entirely unmistakable. Stahl looked at the dog. Stahl looked at Lawson. Stahl looked finally at Senna, and what she saw in his face was not apology. Not yet. It was the precursor to apology, which is the moment when someone realizes that the version of the world they've been operating in does not correspond to the actual world. The recalibration, the arithmetic done rapidly and with poor results. He had come to a hospital floor to diminish a nurse. He had not accounted for any of this. He stopped, started again. I may have spoken out of turn. You did, Lawson said. He did not modulate it. He let it sit. Tamara Rue had come fully out of the nurse's station. The student nurse, Brienne, Senna would learn her name later that afternoon, had straightened against the wall and was no longer looking at the floor. Doctor. Benning had appeared from somewhere with a coffee cup in her hand, watching with the careful stillness of someone who has decided not to speak, because speaking might interrupt something important. Roger Stahl looked at Senna. Mrs. Vail, a different voice than the one he'd been using, smaller. Not fully diminished. Men like Stahl did not fully diminish in a single moment, but adjusted, reconfigured. I apologize for my tone. Senna had spent 11 minutes absorbing what he'd said, and she was not going to spend any more time on it than it deserved. Your father has his 6 o'clock vitals at 5:45, she said. I'll make sure Dr. Benning knows you'd like to speak with her directly about his discharge timeline. She picked up her tablet from the medication cart. She walked back to the nurse's station. Vigil watched Roger Stahl all the way to the elevator. Later, much later, after Stahl had gone and Dr. Benning had quietly pulled Senna aside to tell her that the administrator had been called, but the nursing supervisor had watched the entirety of what happened, and the complaint was being handled accordingly, and that Senna should document everything and then go home. Later, when it was just the two of them in the small family lounge at the end of the hall, Lawson sat beside her on the vinyl couch with Vigil's head across both their knees and said nothing for a long while. He was good at that. It was one of the things she had loved first. You were supposed to be gone for 2 more months, she said. Rotation changed. He glanced at her sideways, tried to call. I was on shift. I know. He reached over and brushed her hair back from her face with one hand, the way he did when he thought she needed to be seen clearly. How long was he at you? 11 minutes. A small shift in his jaw. Nobody said anything? She thought about Tamara's 3 steps and stopped steps. She thought about Brienne and the floor. She thought about the families in the waiting area who had watched the whole thing with the specific guilt of people who know they should have spoken and didn't. Nobody said anything, she said. Vigil exhaled heavily against her leg, the way he did when he'd been holding himself together and was finally allowed to stand down. She put her hand on his back and felt the warmth of him, the solidity of him. This dog who had been in places she could not imagine and come back intact. She had seen his scar before, that ragged seam behind his left ear. She had asked Lawson once, early on, and he had said only that Vigil had taken something meant for his handler, that everyone involved had walked out of it, and that the medic who stabilized Vigil in the field had been a civilian medical volunteer who didn't know the first thing about military working dogs, but had done everything right anyway. Did I ever tell you, Lawson said now, watching her hand on Vigil's back, who that volunteer was, the one who helped him? Senna looked at him. He smiled, faint, private, the smile she had catalogued over 3 years and would never fully get used to. I pulled her file after, he said, wanted to thank her, lost the thread for a while. He looked at Vigil, then back at her. Turns out she went back to ICU nursing in Kentucky, then transferred to a trauma unit in Tennessee. He paused. Then to a medical center in Eastern Carolina, 4th floor. The room was very quiet. Vigil looked up at Senna with the dark, knowing eyes of a dog who had always understood things before they were spoken. You never told me, she said. Didn't know it was you until 3 months into deployment. Old volunteer documentation came up in a debrief. Your ID photo was in the file. He looked at his hands for a moment. Took me a while to figure out how to feel about that. How do you feel about it? Like the world's a lot smaller and a lot more intentional than I give it credit for. He looked at her directly, like some things just keep finding each other. Vigil laid his head back down across their knees, heavy and content, and exactly where he intended to be. Outside the window, the Carolina afternoon was going orange at the edges, the kind of light that made even hospital parking lots look like somewhere worth being. Somewhere down the hall, a monitor beeped its steady, useful rhythm. A cart rattled past. Someone laughed at the nurse's station. Tamara, Senna thought, by the pitch of it. The work would continue. It always did. There would be other long hallways and other bad mornings, and other people who looked at a woman in teal scrubs and decided she was smaller than she was. She knew this. She had always known it. But she also knew, sitting on a vinyl couch in her 15-hour scrubs, Vigil's warmth across her legs and Lawson's shoulder solid against hers, that what had happened today was not just an ending. It was a reminder of what she already knew and what everyone who had stood there watching would carry home tonight and think about in the dark, that the quiet woman who did not raise her voice, did not flinch, and did not ask anyone to come to her defense. She was not small. She had never been small. They had simply not been paying attention.